Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery sits down with Royston Da Costa, Assistant Group Treasurer at Ferguson plc, to discuss a wide range of new technologies that may or will influence finance as we know it. Some of the topics discussed include digital twins, holographic images, and the metaverse. Will Treasury be quick to take advantage of these new technologies? Listen in to find out more.
Royston, it's good to have you back on the Treasury Update podcast. Welcome.
Hey, Craig. Always a joy and a pleasure for me to speak to you.
So when we were talking ahead of time, we talked about digital twins, meta reality, and the intersections of Treasury. I wanted to start with digital twins. I hadn't heard that phrasing before. I'd like to hear you describe that and then, draw that back to how this might relate to Treasury at some point.
Yeah, sure, Craig. I mean, as always with these discussions, I like to preempt them by saying clearly, I'm a treasurer. I'm not an IT expert. But I think it's foolish for anyone today, frankly, whether you're a treasurer or, dare I say, a CFO, to ignore the fact that technology is a big part of our lives. This is the world we live in, and we look around us, we've got smartphones. So I don't need to kind of explain any more than that to say that there's a good reason for why I believe technology is beginning to become a very large part of not just my life, but I think Treasury. And I think there's a lot of benefits that we are realizing from technology. Digital twins is another one that I've come across, which I think is very exciting in terms of how it could benefit and how we could perhaps get to use it in Treasury, and certainly from a corporate perspective. So what's happening with digital twins is, and I'll go into detail in a bit, but just in terms of where it's being used currently, it's using effectively what we call the metaverse, and it is involving 3D and those sort of concepts. But the Dutch are using this technology to replicate a bridge. And what that means is this is a live bridge they have, and they've created a digital twin of that bridge. But it's not just the fact that you can do this digitally, because we know that that's possible. It's more around the technology that they've adopted or implemented to recreate any potential event and all the day-to-day impacts that the live bridge is going through. So that includes traffic, that includes potential accidents, that includes weather events and traffic power failures, that sort of thing. The degree to which this digital twin can then give them the opportunity to plan for any disaster events, to me, is incredible. Because you extrapolate that from a worldwide event perspective, it could be tsunamis, you can talk about pandemic. Although scientists have historically tried to predict them with some degree of accuracy, so often it's been impossible to work out what you do when these events happen. And I think they're also applying this technology to cities, which kind of makes sense, right? Because, God forbid, you ever go through, what was it, that Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina, and what happened in New Orleans. I mean, these sort of events, potentially, in my view, with this technology, shouldn't really catch us by surprise if it's employed or deployed correctly. Now, take it to a Treasury world, and this is obviously where it becomes really interesting. Now, we are treasurers. A big part of our role is about managing risk. And so often, we're reliant on data, clearly, to help us manage that risk. But with the way technology is going and the way that solutions are being developed, it's thankfully, I think, and very exciting, it's helping to, in my view, reduce that uncertainty. That when you hedge an exposure, you can never get it 100% right, because no one can predict it's about 100%. I don't think this technology is necessarily going to be 100%, but it's always, to me, about reducing the margin of error. So if you can get it down from 20% to 5%, that's got to be a lot better than where you are today. Of course, it's got to be better. And at some point, I'm sure there will be a scenario where we'll be almost down to 99%, correct accuracy. But digital twins, I think, is an exciting and powerful, I would say, in what we can expect to see. I would like to think, and again, when I talk about technology and some of the developments we're having today, I never look at something like 10 years. There might be one or two, which I haven't spoken about yet, that could be in that time frame. For me, the way that these technologies are evolving so rapidly, I would say a 5-year time frame is a long time frame for some of these technologies. I would expect to see it much sooner than that. In fact, some of them are already in play, but in terms of Treasury, I would see it being applied and perhaps available well before that time frame is completed.
I was taking the way you were describing the digital twin is it's a digital representative. It's another way of running scenarios in a digital world, like in the case of the bridge. Instead of on the bridge, it's in a digital environment to model and to see how things work and go. And that seems fascinating. A good use of tech applied in this physical realm. Royston at work, one of our senior consultants, was describing how she's using these HoloLens and these immersive, I call them gaming experiences, but the more immersive experiences with games, putting a headset on, there's markers on the floor so you don't get in trouble and bang yourself up in the real world. One of the things that you and I were meeting over a digital meeting, we can see each other, we can smile and laugh and interact. This whole move into COVID, this ongoing increase in virtual meetings via Teams or Zoom, I think we've continued to see the technology getting better and better. What's next for that? But really, what's going on in the digital world that we need to think about, maybe in terms of how it may impact Treasury going forward?
Yeah, and I think this is probably, again, more on the social side of ESG, isn't it? Because, you kind of have to, in my mind, always, whenever you look at something like this technology, there's a bit of rewind clock. I mean, I don't want to even go back 20 years because that would be an incredible story just to sort of compare. I did this the other day for personal reasons, just to kind of compare what sort of technology we were using 20 years ago compared to today. And it's just incredibly, it's quite a eye-opener. But you only have to go back 5 years, in my view. And that's when, frankly, we looked at our first cloud-based solution. And generally, the Treasury world was still very, let's say, reticent, perhaps, in embracing particularly cloud-based solutions. There was a lot of hesitancy and perhaps even suspicion or maybe just caution applied. But one thing that the pandemic has kind of honed in on, and this is aside to the point that you made about gaming, because I'll come back to that in a minute, but just in terms of Treasury, the pandemic brought to light the fact that in the Treasury world, I hate to use the expression, but we are in a sense 24/7, although thankfully, the reality is we don't have to do that. We don't have to work 24/7. But there's an element of urgency in what we do on a day-to-day basis. And when our systems are going down, this is going back in time, or when we haven't got access to technology, it's quite serious. Can be quite damaging in some cases. And I think with the pandemic, for a lot of companies that weren't on the cloud or using cloud-based solutions were caught short and had to effectively equip their staff with laptops in their homes to try and keep business as usual. Those companies like ourselves that had solutions in the cloud were very fortunate. We never knew the pandemic would occur, but I think if we were, being completely honest, going back 5-6 years when we implemented Cooper, there was a thought in our mind that we, in a disaster recovery situation in those days, we had a hot site like most companies. So if the building wasn't accessible or there was a fire, any sort of thing, something like that, major event, we would go to that hot site and we had a kind of process to do that. But with cloud, you don't need to do that. Cloud, you can pretty much work from anywhere as long as you've got access to the internet and Wi-Fi and so on and so forth. So we were kind of prepared in that respect. So when the pandemic kind of really hit home, it didn't affect us, I won't say at all, but as much as other companies. Out of that came this whole kind of, because it's been a long time, review, if you like, or focus on how do we interact with each other, not just within Treasury, but within the company. The mental health topic came up as a big kind of concern naturally for all companies. And I guess whereas gamers have always been used to the concept of being able to interact virtually, might not be as slick as the technology we're using today, or that's coming across today, in 3D, they were still kind of very much in terms of the forerunners for what we're looking at in terms of the metaverse. And so I feel like today, a lot of the companies, the big companies, Microsoft, the Amazons, and the Googles, and some of the fintechs are developing this technology for the simple reason Zoom fatigue is a thing, right? A lot of people are, and I think from a kind of meeting perspective, if you were able to actually be virtually in the same room as the person you're speaking to, there are some inherent benefits to that. There's the whole, you'd have to wear some sort of, virtual augmented reality specs just to help you kind of get into the technology, if you like. But I think that the end result is still very important. And from a personal perspective, I'm based in the US. My treasure is based in the US. I'm based in the UK, I should say. My treasure is based in the US. And when we have our meetings, they're a great team. We're quite interactive. But I can't take away the fact that I'm still on a monitor, on their wall. So the way human nature is, I probably would at some point I've had meetings where we're kind of interact with someone through a Zoom call, and you can sometimes forget that person's even in the meeting. So with this technology, the using holographic images and sort of the metaverse will enhance that whole meeting experience, and it's just another step for me in going forward for companies to help their teams engage wherever they are in the world. Oh, the other thing I meant to mention is in terms of the technology itself. So I think we mentioned it, we discussed it before. I was reminded of a film, believe it or not, going back to the 90s, 1994, with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore, a film called Disclosure. The main theme from the film was an issue they were dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace. The company that the character Michael Douglas playing worked for was called Digitas, and they were developing this technology, which actually looks very similar to what I'm seeing today in terms of the metaverse. They put on these virtual reality specs, and he was able to go into this kind of almost like a storage room where all these files were stored, and he was picking them with these gloves that only today they're saying that with this virtual meetings, they've got the technology now where if you're sort of in a business where you need to feel the product, so to speak, or you need to understand what the product looks like or is how heavy it is, and that this glove, this connected with technology, will enable to do that. So again, it's moving so quickly, and people, I think, in the industry are beginning to see how the technology that exists is going to benefit their business, and in turn, our corporates like ourselves potentially when we're looking at meeting.
I like your example there. Like you've taken it from gaming to buying products. Maybe I'll throw out a couple questions here, maybe it's more of a dialogue on it. How is this technology being applied outside of gaming? You just gave an example, but maybe with a particular focus, Royston, on what is the potential impact for Treasury with this type of technology besides meetings and being able to be more immersive in a meeting, for example. Where might this be applied to Treasury first or second? What are some of the uses here?
Agreed. Okay. So one of the big bugbears I have in Treasury today, and still exists, is KYC, know your customer. You laugh. It's a pain. It's a real pain for a lot of us in Treasury. It's not an easy solution. I totally get it. I mean, look, cyber fraud's still a big thing as well. But I see this technology potentially helping certainly the banks and corporates to some degree to look at resolving this issue, because if you can digitally identify the person that you're looking to validate or to sort of like banks start off and look at a passport photograph or require that document. And it all comes down to, again, the fintechs that are involved and the banks that will be involved in what each one's comfortable with accepting in a way of kind of validating the customer. But it's certainly an opportunity that should be looked at quite seriously. And frankly, that could apply to many other areas, really, if you think about it, because the main area I thought was the corpuses with banks because that's the pain point we experience. But it could be also internally in terms of how you engage with your team members and users within the group. You could probably, I mean, again, it kind of depends how creative the technology companies can be and will be and how secure they can make that solution. But, all the validating that we currently have to do, and admittedly, we've come a long way from having to have wet signatures on documents to accepting digitized documents. But we still need someone to digitally sign that document. I'd like to see a day when a person can be identified, if you think of what we're using in terms of biometric, sort of ID, through an iris scanner or thumbprint. But even the fact that the technology is beginning to be developed in that direction where you can digitally have that person sitting across the table from you. You have to look at some of the futuristic films, which again, I'm not, someone who would claim to have done that. I'm kind of trying to deal with just the reality of what I'm seeing rather than anything that's already, apart from Disclosure, which as I say, 30 years ago, but I can see this huge potential for some of these technologies to help us in Treasury. And this is just purely my own view, obviously, where I think there's this potential scope. I'm not the developer and I'm not the bank, but as a end customer, I'm saying to myself, well, when we looked at, for example, blockchain, again, a lot of people kind of focus immediately on cryptocurrency, and I get it. Cryptocurrency is, it's definitely come a long way since when I first saw it 6 years ago, or heard of it, I should say. But for me, it's always about the distributed ledger technology behind it. And now people are talking about NFTs, I think, it's non-fungible tokens, where you can create a unique footprint. And that's, I think, born out of distributed ledger technology. I have to say, because I get that you can't say anything's 100%. If you say that my solution is 100% secure, guaranteed someone will hack into it at some point. All I look for, and I say to people is, look, where we were 5-6 years ago, where it could be, let's say you're only 50% secure. I mean, it's a bit arbitrary. I'm just making these numbers up. I'd like to think that as a whole, the industry, Treasury, have developed, evolved to become, let's say, 70% foolproof. In terms of security, I'm thinking of cybersecurity. If you can improve those statistics to become 80% proof using quantum computing, for example, or even 90%, who would argue with those numbers? Because the fact that you're not 100%, yes, it's not brilliant, but it's got to be a lot better than 50, 60. And so to me, it's increasing the odds. Until such time, will it ever happen? I can never say that. I can't say that. But it's got to be in the right direction.
Royston, one of the applications in this meta reality, right, where you leverage technology to look at some universe. And I think we were talking about a building or a structure. You gave an example of how that allowed the exploring of, I'm not sure if it was the strength or safety or just reviewing the building. Maybe you could talk about that because I want to tie that back into or extend that into some of what we talked about on the Treasury side.
Yes, again, this is coming back to some of the technologies I've already described, but it's more on the augmented reality technology that I've heard and seen. And to be honest with you, this is not anything that's top secret. A lot of this information I've got from either participating in a webinar or, believe it or not, watching the news. We have an excellent program here in the UK on our, the BBC once a week. It's called Click. And it's only half an hour. And they focus on a lot of the upcoming or current technologies. And these are, what I like about the program, they were going further back. Some people might recognize, certainly in the UK, we used to have a program called Tomorrow as well. And it did very much reflect that concept of tomorrow being not now or tomorrow, literally. It was like always in 10, 15, 20 years away. Whereas this program, Click, I love the way that they actually show you what's happening today. The examples that are in this one I'm going to share with you in a minute, companies that are actually selling this solution as we speak. And there might be an element of where some companies are working on the solution, so it'll be out. But it's not 10, 15, 20 years away. We're talking about 2 to 3 years. So this particular solution, the company involved was called XYZ, or XYZ, as you Americans like to say. And basically, it involved going, if you think about a building site, for example, or a building structure, and I would imagine if you're an engineer, I'm not talking about sort of how things were done previously, but say the ability to go into the site. And this is not new, I would imagine, where you put on these specs and you can see the structure and you can see what's behind the walls, and it's all pretty good. You think fantastic, but then here's the bit that I love about this technology and what this company is doing. You can overlay what the blueprint or the plans for that structure should be, and what parts should have gone where. Now, the degree of accuracy for this is amazing. It's not talking about just your, steel beams or the big kind of, sort of wall structures, whatever. This is talking down to the rivet and to the screw, the bolt, the nut, making sure that you've got the exact right part and it's been put in correctly or installed correctly. To me, it's incredibly powerful, particularly for business like Ferguson, we're in plumbing and heating. And then I thought to myself, I'm sure most of your listeners should be aware of a company called IKEA, which is the DIY company. And I thought to myself, a number of times that I've seen and heard people talk about trying to install one of their products, and they're good. They tend to be, I guess, fairly straightforward. But invariably, I hear people saying, "I've got these bolts left over. Where do they go? I don't get it." So you can see an application like this becoming huge for them, right? You never have to have anything left over, or at least you know why.
You wonder if it's just like they gave extra pieces, or you're missing something, you're going to have a catastrophic failure. But it's like those, there's like 9 million parts. It's almost like, here are the raw materials, forge this cabinet you're going to make. They're great, but you have to follow those parts.
And the serious side to that, Craig, is the fact that I can imagine, particularly larger, if you're looking at a bridge or something, even an aeroplane, for example, these are such a, sort of high risk structure in terms of you've got to get it right. You have to make sure that every part's correctly installed and it's the right part. So I can see this technology being extremely useful in those type of industries. But from a Treasury perspective, I just began to wonder why couldn't that be adopted in Treasury when you're looking at, for example, hedging? You have your set of rules, your hedging rules, and you kind of map them out, put them into place. But admittedly, the degree which you need augmented reality specs is not so useful in that particular example. But that technology behind it should be, should be able to give you almost a similar result, right? Because you're looking at what you put in place, what you should have put in place, and what you actually put in place, and making sure they all match up correctly. Equally, I can imagine you could do that with your bank structure or bank accounts. Wherever you've got some sort of structure in terms of data, whether it's KYC, your security, you want to make sure that what you've put in place matches up to what you should have done or what should have put in place. And it's just getting those type of technologies to really enhance the environment we work in from a treasury perspective.
Yeah, hedging is great. Like, explore the exposures, how they work, the policies, and as you talked about banking structure, there might be a security overlay to that. Like, you have a policy. Well, is it really in place at the account level or transaction level controls? Are they there? And signers, I can see how that could go on and on.
Just one point on there, Craig, if I could just add, I have seen a solution. It's not new, and it's not new technology. But 3-4 years ago, a Far Eastern bank were piloting a cash pooling solution, and they wanted me to look at it because I knew the person then. It was quite innovative at the time. I don't think it's particularly new technology, but think of what we've just discussed. But what was nice or neat about the solution is the fact that they use visual imaging in terms of a global map. And you got your data in there, so you have accounts all around the world, and you see where your cash is visually. It might seem very straightforward and simple, and it is. But if you're looking at something like this technology, where you want to make sure that if you've got, like I said, rules or policies about what cash you have where, I can see using the specs in this case, even though it might seem a bit odd, because you're basically, I would say in the specs, you've got the rules being applied, and you think, say, let's for argument's sake, you've got the UK, you have a limit of no more than 20 million I'm thinking myself, solutions could do this in themselves. But I just think from a virtual interaction perspective, it's giving you everything in one go, if you like. It's all visual and it's kind of more, I feel it's more powerful.
When you think about that, or sometimes when I'm thinking about how we view things, you're going somewhere, you plug something into your phone, or, we used to have GPSs that were dedicated to that, but now our phones tell us that. The turn by turn and optimizing the routing is great. I want to know the macro view. Where am I going? What's the general route? Not 2 turns in front of me. That's it. And it's like, I don't want to be trapped, because what if the power goes out, you lose cell signal? Or macro and micro is like, there's the building, like you said, with your HoloLens or whatever, and you go down to the bolt to see what it is. There's 2 sides. Now, you talked about the speed of technology adoption a couple times and how rapidly things are moving and how some things are in place and they can, I guess, be ported over to Treasury. I wanted to have you talk a little bit more about how quickly will some of this technology be adopted? How should we think about the speed of technology and what's been changing with regard to speed or other areas?
This is a kind of a bittersweet pill to swallow, or even to discuss, frankly. I'll tell you why. Because on one hand, it's extremely exciting when we think about what we have and we could experience further down the road. Because let's be honest, no one wants to implement anything that's going to make their lives more miserable. I'd like to think it's going to enhance our lives. That's what most businesses, I think, are trying to do, right, in terms of the fintechs. I have to think, I always say that, Ferguson, we're not a technology business, right? But clearly technology is a big part of what we use to service our customers and to sell our product. But I can imagine if you're working for a technology company per se, wow, life must be pretty challenging, because one of the things, apart from working for I call it ordinary corporate, what you cannot afford to do, I think, regardless which company you work for, is ignore what we see happening around us. You'll have to look at some of the, dare I say, the skeleton or the companies that have gone bust because they refused technology had arrived and was accelerating at great speed. The business model wasn't sustainable. My view in terms of what's happening today around us and also with Treasury, the big game changers for sure are the fintechs. I think if you look at the discussion and the debate around fintechs going back again 3 to 4 years, there was a lot of fear or concern that fintechs were going to disrupt banks and all that. To be honest, I never saw that. I always believed that banks, in terms of Treasury, please, and society for that matter, have a vital role to play. I think it's like everything, even with our IT department and the way they've had to evolve, banks, I believe, are having to evolve. And they have to recognize that although, and I still believe they have a primary function, just like treasurers have a primary function, technology is here to facilitate and to improve and to enhance. Now, my personal view is that banks should partner with fintechs. And I think we're beginning to see that. And that, to me, where it's happening, is a huge game changer. For the simple reason that if you look at, for example, one of the examples I can give you, when the pandemic kind of hit us, up to that point, most banks would not accept digital documents. And literally overnight, they did. Now, there are a number of discussions have been had around, some banks maybe not having infrastructure or having legacy systems and all that good stuff. Frankly, even Ferguson have had challenges in the past with the systems that we used to have. But you can't afford to, dare I say, hide behind that excuse forever. The way the world's going, if you don't upgrade, you don't implement or have the right technology, then you're not going to be able to succeed as a business because you won't be able to connect or interface with your customers. Customers expect to be able to pay their suppliers online. Those are sort of very small examples. So when we look at the technology, the big change I said was fintechs, but also the banks. The banks partnering with fintechs, I think, it's a fantastic scenario to have because the simple reason that banks have the financial clout. They also have, in my view, the infrastructure to fully vet these fintechs that they would partner with. Corporates like us, on the other hand, we are not early adopters. We've always made that very clear. We like to think we're close followers of technology or solutions, but we don't have that infrastructure where we would be able to look at all the latest solutions and say, right, I'm talking about from a treasury perspective, by the way, this is going to be a good solution for us to partner with. So with the bank partnering with that fintech and coming to us and saying there's a fantastic solution we can offer you, I think we're going to be much more receptive. And it's a win-win from our perspective because the bank effectively are, sort of backing that solution. And then overlay on top of that, the pace at which these fintechs are progressing. So one example, and it's not particularly relevant to Treasury, but just to give you a sense of the speed at which these technologies are evolving. One of the companies I've seen recently present on a, believe it or not, webinar hosted by a bank is Etvol, which is a car that converts into a helicopter. I believe the retail price is going to be quite significant, something like $800,000. The price is not, it's just give you context. But in terms of when it would be in production, it's looking at 3 to 4 years from now. A car converts into a helicopter. They did say China and India are probably the first 2 countries to kind of implement this type of vehicle. But I can just imagine 4 years' time, 5 years' time, perhaps certain parts of the, I know in the US, Arizona have got autonomous vehicles in Arizona, but not all the states, and I can see why. But you can see that this type of technology will begin to, once the regulation in each of the countries, and obviously they have to be kind of looked at and how it would work. But you can almost think of an Uber coming to pick you up, and distance and time will be something of the past. It has to be done safely. I agree. But this will be worked out over time. But think 3, 4 years time, somewhere in the world, someone will be driving a car which will then convert to a helicopter. Amazing. But let's be also clear in terms of what I understand how and who would be able to drive these cars. And obviously you'd have to have some sort of qualification to be able to suddenly kind of fly a helicopter. But I think that's also going to have to be heavily regulated. But still, at the end of the day, you trust the person that picks you up in the Uber to have a license, and most often they, other sort of walks of life, you do. You have to have the required credentials to do what you're doing. So anyway, in terms of time frame, I think that time frame is getting shorter and shorter, and this is why I would say there's this urgency sometimes when I look at what I see today, to think, well, we can't afford to just assume that this is not going to happen or it doesn't affect me. And, we'll wait for maybe 5, 6 years when everyone else is using it. You'll find that, particularly with the banks now involved, there are customers of theirs that are probably already adopting some of this technology because they want the competitive edge. And clearly that's got to be a major factor in the day.
Royston, I've been looking forward to a car that can also drive on the water. Now I can be thinking about the helicopter side too. But on the speed and change in attitudes, blockchain's been in the news, and you had an interesting story that you were telling me the other day. I was wondering if we could finish with how that has changed, in fairly recent times.
That's a good point, actually, and it kind of accentuates the point I've been making so far. So 3 years ago, I attended the AFP conference. I think it might have been Chicago, and met with one of our banking partners there, and a fintech or one of our vendors who had a very interesting blockchain solution, which I thought would be quite of great interest to our banking partner. My experience was unfortunately not as impressive because the bank just didn't seem to want to know. Now, it's interesting when I look back, part of the reason could have been that they didn't see this type of technology as being anything that would be would evolve or would be sustainable. But I also thought there was an element of where maybe they felt that the fintech was perhaps too small, maybe unheard of, or whatever the reason was. But like, I guess when we look at fintech, we sometimes say, well, if you compare them to So from an ERP solution provider, there's no comparison. They're so small generally in the TMS world anyway. Lo and behold, this same bank today is now investing over $10 billion. That's $10 billion in technology. And I love the fact that they are fully engaged. They are not only engaged, but they're actively evolving and partnering with fintechs and also reaching out to their customers that are interested in looking at these kind of very interesting solutions, very radical. Because although we all work in Treasury, I get that. I find that we are becoming kind of increasingly major stakeholders within our company. And I've heard this mentioned before as well. Since the economic crisis 2008, treasurers have become major stakeholders on boards and so on and so forth. But I think the technology angles bring us even more so into play with other parts of our company. For example, procurement, supply chain, tax. There are solutions, even IT for that. I'm just talking about technology, IT. And one thing actually I do want to share with you, Craig, is that, and this probably might be a different session we have to have, but the relationship with IT, in my experience, not just at Ferguson, but generally, hasn't been as positive as I like to have thought. I'm talking about in my 34 years experience as a treasurer. But what I'm really pleased to say is today, our IT CSO, this is our Chief Information Security Officer, actively reaches out to us, to me in Treasury, to engage with me, say, what are you hearing about in the technology world? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about, I'm doing his job for him because I'm not qualified to him. We're not talking about security here. I'm talking about applications that are coming across my desk because of the banks that are involved, with the fintechs that they're involved with, and the information they're sharing with us. Because at the end of the day, I was trying to say earlier on, even though we work in Treasury, we work for a company that's obviously looking to succeed in the business that we're in. So you can even think in terms of, let's say, mergers and acquisitions. Yes, you can see that kind of direct link to Treasury. But quite often, there's a commercial aspect to that transaction, which treasurers have often been required to add the expertise in. So you can see that, I think, in going forward, why and how it's so important that the roles that we have and the way that that role is evolving and developing, we are able to connect. And I like to also use that expression where if there were any silos, and sometimes you do find this in companies, those silos are rapidly being broken down for this very reason, that due to many circumstances that have happened over the last 10 years, but I like to think in particular, technology has been the catalyst. And it's not just a catalyst, it's almost like a turbo booster of various kind of developments that are happening. It's great to see today that banks are beginning to get involved, get engaged, and with their particular kind of financial planners saying their sort of backup, it's a good win-win situation from a corporate perspective, I like to think. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hopefully next time we speak, and I don't expect that will be too long because, as you know, as talking about the speed of how some of these things evolve, I'm pretty certain we'll have a different discussion. Probably even wow, that's already happened. We're here now.
Royston, thank you so much.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.